بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome everyone to the introduction to the Shafi'i Madhab course. Inshallah, in today's lecture, it will be slightly different than the other lectures. This is really going to be an introduction to the concept of the course itself, and I want to give you some important things to keep in the back of your mind so that as you progress throughout the courses, you will know why I'm doing certain things, saying certain things, and you'll know what to emphasize in your note taking. So, in today's course, inshallah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what a madhab is. I'm also going to talk about why this course itself, the introduction to the Shafi'i madhab, is a new approach to studying Islamic law. It's not something necessarily that we had in the past. We will also learn in this course some of the important concepts that will be used as the foundation for the rest of the lectures. So this is more of an establishment or an establishing lecture in which I want to impart to you the meta concepts, let's call them the meta concepts, upon which this course will be based, so you understand, as I said just a little while ago, the rhyme and reason of what the course is going to be about. I think that this course is very important for a number of reasons, and inshallah, towards the end of this introductory lecture, I also want to talk about why it's important that you have this course and why it's important that hopefully, inshallah, you start your studying of the madhab or of fiqh and usul according to the Shafi'i approach with this course, so you have this framework. Having a framework is going to be very important. So there's not going to be so much names and dates, names of books in this lecture, but it's going to be more of an overview of the approach to the introduction to Islamic law and specifically the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i, inshallah. So this will be, a lighter type of lecture than perhaps the other ones that will come, in which they'll be very heavy in names, dates, places, so on and so forth. So some of the things to keep in mind as you, inshallah, watch the next 3 clips. As I said in the introductory lecture, or the introduction to these lectures, the concept of having an introduction to a madhab course, or an introduction to Islamic law, or a course that's maybe might be titled the history of Islamic law, or the history of usul al-fiqh, or the history of ilm al-kalam. You find a lot of these in the Islamic library. When I use the word Islamic library, it is a term that means all of the intellectual output that has gone into, from the time of the Salaf till our time, to studying Islam. Of course, we mean primarily by those within the tent of Islam, the big tent of Islam, those who are the ulama, the students of the mashayikh, connected with unbroken chains back to the Prophet ﷺ, etc. But we will also include, perhaps in the last 200 years, a lot of the Orientalist writings that have gone into studying Islam from a very different perspective. Of course, it goes without saying that many of those approaches are flawed. Many of those approaches are incorrect. They've made grave mistakes in translation. But nonetheless, it is part of the intellectual output that any true scholar of a Islamic subject needs to understand those things as well. So the term Islamic library, al-Maktabat al-Islamiyya, is this, metaphor for all of the intellectual output. So when you walk into this theoretical large library, the Islamic library, let's say in the last 50 to 60 years, you will find books that will say, Tarikh al-Fiqh al-Islami, or Tarikh Usul al-Fiqh, or Tarikh Ilm al-Kalam, the history of these different subjects. This is a new approach. And just because it's new, it doesn't mean that it's bad, or it doesn't mean that something was wrong in the past, but there is a reason why the ulama have sought to do this. And that's why I wanted to have the first lecture of the series sort of to cover some of these things, because I think it's very important for you to know why we have this, why it's part of the curriculum, and where we're going with it. We are about to embark on this tremendous journey in which we are going to summarize essentially over 1,000 years, or about 1,000 years of intellectual history of a particular approach to Islamic law. That's a lot. 1,000 years is a lot of time, a long period of time in which there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have contributed to this body of knowledge that we are about to study. If you were living 400, 500, 600 years ago, the time was kind of halved. And in a traditional setting, if you were going to study the Shafi'i madhab for the first time, what you are going to study is you're going to study a primer text like the Matn of Abi Shuja, which is one of the main texts that we use in our curriculum. And you would advance to a commentary, and then from that commentary to a hashia, and then from that to some of the larger, more mu'tamad, reliable books of the madhab. Why? Because what we are going to discuss in these lectures, in this course, was almost assumed that the student and the teacher and the learning environment already knew. They already knew some of the major figures. They already knew what a madhab of Islamic law is. They already knew that when you say the word, قال النووي, and Nawawi says inside the classroom of the Shafi'i college that is an authoritative statement, that what follows from that, in a sense, negates any kind of conflict that comes before it. Now that's what I just said. You might not know that. We might not know that now. You might be like, oh, and Nawawi was this blessed person, but there are other people who said other things. When you are in a distance from that core understanding, and the things that were assumed by the early generation are no longer known or shared, that is when we have the need for these types of courses. So this course, I would say, is one of the most essential courses to a student's journey. I remember when I was studying at Al-Azhar, I did not have this approach in the very beginning. I as we say in English, they threw me into the deep end, and I started off by studying the deep books, the Hawashi and the Usul al-Fiqh and some really far out stuff, and I was just treading water to stay afloat. And it was later that I realized what was missing, or what I needed to help put all of those data points together, was this framework of the introduction to the madhab. And this type of course exists, and these books exist for almost all of the madhab, Sunni and Shia as well. So this is something that is shared across the spectrum of Islamic learning, alhamdulillah, and something that is of great benefit. So I don't want you to jump into the deep end and have to survive like that, but rather I want you to learn about this from the beginning, so you have the right type of framework. The other point that I would like to make is that it's important to understand what a madhab is, because oftentimes there are misconceptions, misunderstandings on both sides of the spectrum. So there are those people that will say that the madhab is a human construct, which it is, and will say that there's no need for it. We want to go purely to the Quran and Sunnah, and that's where the flaw in that line of thinking is. And then there's the other extreme that people will say, maybe they won't even say it explicitly, but they will act like it, that my madhab is Islam and that all other approaches are wrong. It's a type of ta'assub, a type of extreme mentality, and both of those we want to avoid. Rather, we want to be in the middle, as Allah Ta'ala has referred to us, ummatan wasata, that we are a middle nation. All of the madhahib, wherever they hail from within Islam, are all ways to interpret the Quran and Sunnah. And that's the most important thing for you to know. But if you were to put in front of you the canon of the hadith, with the different riwayat, we have about 100,000 hadith. So let's assume that you were able to put them all in front of you, maybe some digital format or some page format, and you had this fantastic AI tool, and you could look at everything. What you would start to realize is that there are quote unquote contradictions. One set of hadith says that the Prophet ﷺ and the companions made wudu from anything that they ate that touched the fire. And then right after that you will find another set of hadith equally compelling in the same collection, even the same strength, saying the exact opposite, that the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba didn't wash themselves from things that touched the fire. So if you do not know how to weigh this evidence, you're like, well, I don't understand. They're contradicting each other. Do I do this or do I do that? Is this right or is this wrong? So of course, this is more of what is these issues that I'm bringing up is more of what is addressed in the discipline of usul al-fiqh. So when we get to study usul al-fiqh together, inshallah, we'll get into that stuff in detail. But it's important just to have this framework of understanding is that these quote, I put it in air quotes, contradictions, because they're not contradictions, because every piece of evidence has its usage, has its way of being applied or not applied, has its way of being interpreted or not interpreted. Some things are general, some things are specific, some things are absolute, some things are partial, some things have been abrogated, some things are not abrogated, some things there's a genuine difference of opinion, some things are based and hinged on the interpretation of the language of the words that are used, so on and so forth. So my point is that from the time of the Sahaba themselves, radiallahu anhum, there were differences of opinion. There were different quote-unquote madahib. One of the things that we will learn, one of the tremendous advantages that Imam Shafi'i has. And by the way, I'm a Shafi'i and this is the Shafi'i course. I personally have a great deal of respect and love for Imam Shafi'i. So I praise him and I acknowledge him, but I would say the same thing to all of the other great Imams, Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu anhu, Al-Awza'i, Layth ibn so on and so forth, radiallahu anhum ajma'in. So don't think that this is me being muta'assib, that I am saying he's the best, but one of the tremendous advantages that he had, Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, when we get into the next few lectures, his biography, we will see that he was able to take from several streams that go back to clusters of Sahaba that emerged after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ to Al-Rafiq al-A'la. There were these different quote-unquote, let's call them proto-madhabs, different approaches that we found in Medina, or we found in Mecca, or we found in Baghdad, or we found in Asham, or we found in Egypt. And they all trace themselves back to the Sahaba. So these madhahib, these approaches, are the human attempt to understand the meaning of the Quran and Sunnah and how to apply that into the different circumstances, whether they be in the ibadat or whether they be in the mu'amalat. Of course, the ibadat, the prayer, the things that we do out of acts of worship, our prayer, our fasting, hajj and umrah, zakah, that's the narrow and limited part of the sharia, and the mu'amalat is essentially everything else. We'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So we left off talking about what a madhab is. So I want you to understand that the madhab is our attempt using tools. Those tools are the tools have been codified for us in usul al-fiqh, but let's just say that the madhab is our attempt as human beings to use certain tools, interpretive tools, to understand the meanings of the Quran and Sunnah and how to apply those into the real life circumstance. So, that sentence, if you sort of devise it, kind of iron it out, as we say in English, there are a lot of details. And in those details, as we say, the devil's in the details, which is an expression that simply means that in those details, that's where we will find the seeds of the differences of opinion. So the other thing that I want you to learn as a student of law is that you have to be comfortable with there being differences of opinion. Now, some people, and myself included, sometimes in aspects of life we like to be black or white. Right? It's either yes or no. It's either right or left. It's either up or it's down. However, unfortunately, when it comes to Islamic law, it's not going to be that simple. It's this and this. It's left and right. It's up and down. It's yes and no. It's wajib and it's sunnah. It's makruh and it's mubah. And we'll find a lot of that. I mean, when we put all of the madahib together. So, one of the things that you will learn if you are blessed by Allah Ta'ala with long life and dedication to the study of this subject matter, one of the things, let me give you sort of like the conclusion of the greats. What did the greats conclude? The greats conclude that all of the madahib are essentially the same. They just are like different pressures or different degrees of yes and no. So, that's why I began by saying there are these two extremes we want to avoid. Those extremes are a sign that somebody really doesn't understand Islamic law. But rather, the deeper and deeper you get. Now, we're going to study one madhab. But in the journey of studying this one madhab, we will learn about other opinions because you have to. But you can only study one madhab in the beginning. It's like if you go to a university, you have to go to this college or that college. You can't go to all of them at the same time. But if you spend enough time in one college, then you are going to learn about some of the things that happen in the other college. You might take an elective here, an elective there. Studying Islamic law is the same way. So even though we are going to start this journey together on this one madhab, over the course of time, especially when we talk about the furu'a and when we talk about the usul, we will learn about the differences of opinion. The longer you go down this journey, the more you will realize they're really all saying the same thing, but there's just slightly different emphasis here and a slightly different emphasis there. And that the genuine differences of opinions are very, very few and far in between. So that is the conclusion of somebody like Imam al-Sha'rani in his great book Al-Mizan al-Kubra, in which he talks about all of from the perspective of somebody who is deeply engrossed in the study of Islamic law. They'll realize that all of it's really just one approach, but some people have a different emphasis here and different emphasis there. And in that plurality is the great mercy that we know. So in this differences of opinion, it's a tremendous mercy that Allah Ta'ala has given us, that we have all of these wonderful options and all of these different approaches and all of them that we equally respect. So that's another big thing that I want you to learn, is that even though we are going to study one person's approach and the people who have been dedicated to that approach, I want you to also understand that there is plurality, and that plurality is something that we celebrate. The next point that I want you to understand is, what do we mean when we say the Shafi'i madhab? Now, this is also a point of great misconception for people, because when we say the Shafi'i madhab, this is not just about one man called Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, but rather it is the interpretive approach that Imam al-Shafi'i laid down, that the people that follow that approach are called Shafi'i. But any school of law or any school of thought is a living organism, is something that grows, or it can decay and die. And it requires hundreds, if not thousands, of people of different levels, of different skill sets, to continue the intellectual project laid out. What do I mean by the approach, interpretive approach, laid down by Imam al-Shafi'i? In this regard, one of the unique features of the Shafi'i madhab is that Imam al-Shafi'i left us exactly what that is, and he left us a book called Al-Risala. And we will come to see that the Risala is one of the greatest books in human history. Not just in the history of Islam, but in human history. Because Imam al-Shafi'i, in very meticulous detail, even though the book itself is not that long, alhamdulillah, but it's detailed enough, he left us a map of what he means by his approach in understanding the Quran and Sunnah. So those, in the previous clip I talk about those quote-unquote contradictions, he left us a map of how to understand those apparent contradictions in the Quran, in the Sunnah, as they relate to language, as they relate to the various qira'at of the Quran, for example, etc., etc., etc. He talked about consensus, ijma', he talked about qiyas, analogy, and he laid down for us what were the seeds of the science of usul al-fiqh. So when we come to study usul al-fiqh in any madhab, we consider Imam al-Shafi'i to be one of the first, because there are some other Hanafis that might have written, around the same time or slightly afterwards. But for all intents and purposes, if this was Jeopardy and the question was who started usul al-fiqh in Islam, the right answer would be Imam al-Shafi'i, and he left this book Al-Risala. There'll be many lectures, a couple lectures inshallah coming soon, and which we will dedicate to understanding why that book is important. So Imam al-Shafi'i, in the book of the Risala, which by the way is not exhaustive, it's not everything that has to do with usul al-fiqh, but it's a lot, he left us this map, this approach. You take that approach, you put them on as like goggles, and then you go to the Quran and Sunnah and you read the Quran and Sunnah with that lens. If you do that, then you are a Shafi'i. So because Imam al-Shafi'i wrote that, and because he set that in motion, we refer to everyone that follows after him, including ourselves, as Shafi'i. In other words, we follow that approach. But that does not mean everything is confined to what Imam al-Shafi'i said. As we will come to see, every generation there are many important figures And when you study Shafi'i fiqh, as I mentioned, as a young student, and young I don't mean by age, I mean young in your your level of study, you're not going to read a book by Imam Shafi'i. You're going to read a book by somebody else who wrote down the basic principles of furu'a, or who wrote down the basic principles of usul. I mean, we don't study the risala. We study the waraqat as the introductory books to usul al-fiqh, for example. And then we advance to that to something like, Lubb al-Usul by Zakaria al-Ansari. And then we might advance from something like that to the books of al-Baydawi, or al-Asnawi's commentary, or Jam' al-Jawama by Subki, so on and so forth. In none of those do you hear the word Imam al-Shafi'i. So the Shafi'i madhab, it's given the name because of the person who started it and laid down those procedures and those interpretive tools. And then the people that use those tools and are loyal to those tools and apply them to interpreting the Quran and Sunnah and solving problems and fatwas and things like that, and judge qada in courts and so on and so forth, those people then are called a Shafi'i. But there is a lot of intellectual movement within the madhab. So I don't want you to think of the madhab as something as isolated or static, but rather it's a dynamic living being. And it is in need of this type of interaction of teacher and student. And the Shafi'i madhab particularly encourages ijtihad amongst its students. So one of the things that you learn is you learn how to engage in ijtihad so you can continue to add. That's what makes an intellectual project grow. If we don't have that, then it will die. And as we will see, there were a couple of people or a couple of madahib rather at that time that died because they did not have enough students to engage in the active studying, discussion of the madhab. So that's one of the other things that is important for you to learn. The next thing that I want to talk about is sort of based on what we just said, is usul al-fiqh itself. So a madhab really is its usul. And usul al-fiqh is the crowning science of the Islamic sciences. It is our operating system. It's the way that the Muslims think. It's the way that the Muslims interpret, interact with the world around them, solve problems, continue the tradition. So even though this course is a history, a lot of what we are going to highlight is those people who have added to usul al-fiqh. The furu'a is important as well, but the furu'a is like a snapshot in time. And in the next clip, let me explain what that means, inshallah. When I say that the furu'a, or the legal writings of a madhab, positive law, or sometimes it's called, is a snapshot in time, it means the person that wrote that furu'a, using the usul of the madhab at that point in time, came up with these interpretations. Which means that today, as Shafi'i is using the same interpretive tools, we might have slightly nuanced understandings or adaptations or slight differences in the application. Because the Quran and Sunnah is absolute, but as it is interpreted into the world around us changes. The four things that constitute the world around us, and this is something that you need to know, is time, place, people, and circumstance. Time changes, people changes, the place changes, circumstances change. These are called al-arba jihat, the four aspects of the waqa, of the here and now that change. So as we bring the Quran and Sunnah into the here and now, using the usul of a particular madhab, it might manifest in a slightly different way. And that's why we will find differences of opinion within our own madhab in how you interpret. Again, those differences, as I said before, we celebrate, whether they be between the madhab or intra-madhab, we celebrate those differences because it gives us this tremendous flexibility that essentially our tradition is continually valid and applicable all time, place, people, and circumstance. All Muslims know that. That's what, now you know what it means. So the furu'a is important, and we have chosen as our core curriculum some of the latter books of the furu'a, so you can understand some of the latest, let us say, thinking on certain aspects. But that is a process that will never end. But equally important, if not more important, is the usul, understanding the usul. Now, this is not a course on usul al-fiqh, but I'm saying this so you understand as we go forward. We will spend a lot of time talking about usul and those Shafi'is that contributed to the science of usul al-fiqh and why they are very much important as well. So those are some of the 3 or 4 main kind of concepts I wanted to convey to you. The other thing I would like to share with you is that this is a class on history. So we will spend quite a deal, not necessarily half, but we will spend quite a deal of many lectures describing the biography of Imam Shafi'i himself. Now, when we talk about Imam Shafi'i, I'm not going to go so much into the political stuff, but it's very important that you understand the political age in which he lived in. Now, of course, Imam Shafi'i is from the Salaf. He was born in 150 of the Hijrah and died in 204. So he lived at a very, very unique time, very early. But he didn't live too early that he was witness to the fitna that happened between the Sahaba and then the immediate community. So by the time Imam Shafi'i is coming of age, there is relative political stability during the Abbasid Khilafah. And this is very important because you will come to see that this political stability are the circumstances that Allah Ta'ala decreed upon Imam Shafi'i, he was born into that allowed his intellectual project to thrive. So when we talk about the history or an introduction to the Shafi'i madhab and we talk about the history of the Shafi'i madhab, it's very, very important that you also learn, as I know it's a little bit more data and I'm asking you a lot, but I have confidence in your skills. It's very important that you remember some of the background stuff, the political stuff that's happening. You have to have a framework, just a basic framework of Islamic history. I'll talk about some of the khulafa that lived, that Imam al-Shafi'i lived through their time and things like that. Not so much. I'm not going to overdo it. But when we talk about other people later, anytime you're interested in a particular figure from the madhab, always make sure you ask as a secondary question, what type of political circumstance, socio-economic circumstance did they live through? Because that's very important so you can kind of see the type of waqa, the type of life that they occupied, the here and now of their time, and how that impacted and how those people chose to live their life and advance the study of the madhab. Now, related to this, as I mentioned maybe a little bit earlier, is I also want you to remember and keep in mind when we talk particularly about the biography of Imam Shafi'i, I want you to understand and learn how the different people he took from, how those people trace back to those clusters of Sahaba that were the proto-madhabs. It's very, very important that you remember that because you must rid yourself of any notion that Islamic law started with Imam Abu Hanifa or started with Imam Malik or started with Imam Shafi'i. But rather you need to learn that those are codifications of the fiqh that was taught by the Sahaba, then for the Tabi'een and down the line. So when I talk about the early history, inshallah, we will also get to learn about who those proto-madhabs or who those Sahaba were. That's an important thing that I want you to keep in mind. I was going to mention some names, but I thought maybe there's no point of doing that. Right now, we'll save that for the next, when we get into the actual history of Imam Shafi'i proper. Okay, so that's one thing that I want you guys to pick up on, inshallah, throughout these courses. Now, some other last minute things that I want to mention before we conclude this first lecture is that when I talk about the history of after the biography of Imam Shafi'i, then we'll talk about how the history of the madhab evolves. This is a human construct, and there is no, I can't say definitively that, phase one. I will refer to phases of times, and these are what I want you to know. These are artificial constructs. Reality, human, history is like this, and the madhab is like that. But we do, as modern people, try to impose some kind of structure on the history. You don't have to be so, when I say that the first phase of the madhab starts with this and ends with this person, I'm always going to go like this with my hands, like approximately, plus or minus. It's not, it's not a hard and fast rule. But there is a meta structure that I want you to learn, that there is the works of Imam Shafi'i and his companions, and then that lasts until the first redaction, the tanqiyah that occurs during the time of Al-Rafi'i and Al-Nawawi, and then that lasts until the second tanqiyah or the second redaction that happens at the time of Al-Haytami and Al-Ramli, and then there is the latter period. That basically is the structure that most Shafi'is and most historians of Islamic law will agree to. Again, plus or minus, because not all of these people lived at the same time. Sometimes there's a gap between them, sometimes they were contemporaries. But these are the main points. I will, of course, offer more structure to that, but that basic, you have to keep that in your mind. That's basically what we're looking at. Imam Shafi'i, what he did and his immediate students, and the proliferation of that until there's a redaction that happens. The tanqiyah of Nawawi and Al-Rafi'i and the tanqiyah later of Al-Haytami and Al-Ramli, those are very important milestones of the madhab, which is why I said in the beginning, in the Shafi'i, if we're in a classroom of Shafi'is and we're saying, oh, I found this, Al-Mawardi says this, or Al-Buwaiti says that, or something like that, but then somebody comes and says, but Al-Nawawi says, now you will know why Al-Nawawi says like that. That's it. That's the end of the discussion. That means the right answer is what Al-Nawawi said. So why is that the case? So you need to understand what that redaction means, the tanqiyah that happens at the time of Al-Rafi' and Nawawi, and then Al-Haytami and Al-Ramli, why that's important. Because as you advance in your studies, you need to learn what are the reliable opinions on in the madhab. If you are confused about something, which sources do you go back to, etc. That basic structure is important. As I said, I will give more substructures, but every author is going to carve up things slightly different, and I'm not too big on those differences. I'm not going to nitpick, but I will offer what I think is an accurate understanding. The last thing I will say is that related to this is that each time we get to a time period or a phase, I will do my best to mention the most important jurists of that time. Allah forgive me, I'm not going to be able to mention everybody. And I am going to mention the important jurists, why they are the most important, and inshallah, the main writings that they had. These are the type of things that you need to take notes on. You need to know these names, you need to know some of these writings, because as you amass for yourself a library, whether it be digital or physical, you have to have these sources at your disposal. If you're going to be a real student and scholar of the Shafi'i madhab, you need to look up things, you need to research things, people will ask you questions, you need to know what the reliable works are to answer those questions, etc. So this course will be a little heavy in the names and the writings, and those are the things that you need to know. And then lastly, we will spend some time talking about the mustalahat, the terminology that we use in the Shafi'i madhab, not all of them, but some of them, so you know what these words mean as you encounter them into your sources. I think this is enough for an introduction to the introduction, and we will begin inshallah in the next lecture. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Alhamdulillah, in this first lecture, which is my introduction to the introduction of the Shafi'i madhab course, I wanted to lay out some basic ground rules and concepts that I think are important for you to understand, so you understand our approach, where we're coming from. One of them is to understand that this is a new approach to the studying of Islamic law, and this is largely a function of the great distance that we have from the origin, over 1,000 years of intellectual history. So the things that I said that are assumed in the past for students and teachers alike might not necessarily be assumed by us today, which necessitates that we have this introductory course. And I think that this is a good thing. I shared maybe some personal insights about my own journey and how this was a very helpful approach for me when I was able to acquire it. Other thing, I wanted you to understand what a madhab is, that the madhab is our approach, meaning our human beings' approach using certain interpretive skills, quote unquote, usul al-fiqh, to understand the Quran and Sunnah, its meanings and its application. And that's what a madhab is. So every madhab is based on those interpretive tools laid down by its founder. In this case, the founder of the madhab is Imam Shafi'i, who actually wrote down his interpretive approach in the book Ar-Risala, which we still have, alhamdulillah, and we narrate with a direct chain of transmission back to Imam Shafi'i himself, radiallahu anhu. And people that are loyal to that approach, those people are called Shafi'is. But that doesn't mean that everything that Imam Shafi'i wrote it was done with Imam Shafi'i and we just simply copy. No, there is the process of ijtihad to interpret. And in that regard, we learned a little bit about the difference between the furu'a and the usul. The furu'a being, as I called it, a snapshot in time, and then the usul being those interpretive tools that help us understand and have these nuanced understandings. Another important thing I wanted you to keep in mind is that we will talk about the proto-madhabs, the quote-unquote madhabs laid down by the Sahaba in different parts of the Muslim world. And Imam Shafi'i was fortunate that he took from those different streams. So as we get to that part of the history, I want you to know who were the origins, who were the Sahaba origins of these different schools of law. So you no longer, I want you to think that Shafi'i madhab is just Imam Shafi'i. He started and there was nobody before him. No, there was people before him, people before Imam Abu Hanifa, people before Malik, people before Al-Awza'i, radiallahu anhum ajma'in. And then we also talked about how it's important to know some of the political history we'll make reference to, and at each time or phase, which is an artificial construct, I will mention to the best of my ability the major jurists, the major Shafi'i jurists. I'll mention their names, why they're important, and the writings that they had, and those are things that I want you to remember. And also, we will be later in the course, we will talk about the mustalahat or the terminology that we use in the Shafi'i madhab, which is important. So when you come to read some of the texts of the madhab, you will understand what those words are. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.